Unit 8.1, Part 3, homework video. So we have discussed some of the battles. We've talked about how the United States has been drawn into the war, the immediate causes, the long-term causes, the Eastern Front, the Western Front. Now we're going to talk about the concept of total war used in World War I, kind of briefly mentioned before in lecture, but this involved mass civilian populations in the war effort, so it wasn't just the soldiers. This is the concept where you're going to involve all of the peoples in the war, civilian, jobs at home, and the soldiers on the front. And so this is a whole civilization versus a whole civilization, not just German soldier versus British soldier. This is like German woman working in factory versus British woman working in factory. And so we're going to see a massive conscription or a drafting of the most able-bodied men in their youth in each country. In some cases, civilian populations are going to become targets because it is total war. Early in the war, we're going to see that Germany uses Zeppelins to bomb London. And we're going to see that the British blockade, of course, that didn't just affect soldiers. That was starving or cutting off things for everyone in Germany. And so we see the civilian population dragged into World War I. Of course, frustration is dragging on as people had expected this war to be over by Christmas, and it is not. And so we're going to see the use of propaganda to try to keep the morale high in our wartime, to keep that nagging feeling of we should not still be at war away. Propaganda is going to show a deep hatred of the enemy, and all other news is really going to be censored to aid in that propaganda effort. It's going to lionize men at the front and dehumanize the enemy, mainly through the use of posters. You could just spend days going through all of the World War I propaganda posters. I have some here. So I help Uncle Sam stamp out the Kaiser. Buying bonds will be a big issue to support the war effort and propaganda. Defeat the Kaiser and his U-boats. Victory depends on which fails first, food or frightfulness. Eat less wheat. So there's rationing, making sure that you're consuming less so that the war effort can continue on. Beat back the Hun with Liberty Bonds. Of course, with the hat here, you see that the Hun here is supposed to be the Germans, made to look very dehumanized in each poster. It goes back to the Boxer Rebellion where the Kaiser had said, let's defeat them like the Huns of old, and so then Hun becomes associated with the Germans. So that you will see that on lots of posters, and the dehumanization. I mean, like you have the Germans here. I remember the Germans, as they had marched through Belgium, it said that they had like raped nuns and put children on pikes, and so it gets very the hatred of the enemy comes through, and like you can see here, the German with the culture beating stick, and the half-dressed woman, Liberty, or representation, they're stepping onto U.S. soldier soil, so we need to defeat them before they can get here, beat back the Hun by buying Liberty Bonds, etc. British propaganda is going to promote that they are defending law, liberty, and rights. So you also have the reverse. You'll see some posters that are, instead of going after the Hun, that support the British, we're protecting liberty and rights. And then, of course, you'll have the anti-enemy hatred of the enemy posters as well. Intense nationalism demanded support from the entire population, and that was really the purpose of these propaganda posters, was to gather support to keep morale high. Some historians are going to contend that Germany increased its belligerency in the 1890s in order to rally the masses behind the government. And so we'll see this belligerency that's being promoted in propaganda, but almost increased to even look that way, because the Germans are having a hard time rallying the masses and want to keep the morale up for this war. They want to keep belligerency, and posters on the other side of this is mainly U.S. version posters, to bring in the hatred of Americans, of British or French, and slow down the growth of the SPD. That's the Socialist Party in Germany. The Germans really think that they're being divided, because if you remember about socialists, socialists are internationalists. They wouldn't want to stop and fight a war like worker against worker. That would be anti their cause. And so the Germans are going to try to slow down the SPD by becoming very belligerent towards them in this time. They want nationalism over socialism, and this is going to be a big blow for the Socialist Party. And this is the topic of your DBQ for this class that's due the day before spring break. So in that DBQ, it's going to address this use of the Bergfrieden, which is a Middle Ages term that the Germans will reimpose in this time period. But the SPD realizes that they're going to be very limited in this war effort, or the government's coming after them. So in 1914, the SPD, then the largest party in the Reichstag, our parliament, is going to agree to support the war. So they are going to funnel their support towards the war as part of the civil peace with the Kaiser, or the Bergfrieden. And this is what your DBQ is about. The outbreak of civil peace, as you can see here on the screen, war was consciously viewed by members of the German elites as an escape forwards, a solution to the problems of peace, a means of deflecting attention from unresolved problems at home. German soldiers marched off to war singing patriotic songs in the happy delusion that an early victory would allow them to be home by Christmas. And so this Bergfrieden is going to support the war effort by getting the SPD behind the war and kind of putting these problems at home on hold to keep the war effort going. You kind of compare that to what was happening in Britain that we talked about with the issue of Irish independence, trying to keep that at bay until, to unify at home during this time period. So don't forget that DBQ is due the Thursday before spring break. Latest, get it to me before we leave the building for spring break. So you have 2 weeks to work on that. So next, D here, economic production will also become focused on the war effort, which is part of total war. You can pretty much say bye-bye to laissez-faire here. During wartime, we're going to see the success of some socialist studies, of controlled economies, of government controlling the economy. Free market capitalism will be abandoned in favor of strong central planning of the economy because it's necessitated in total war. You have to make sure that consumption at home is not so much that you can't support the troops financially with supplies. Remember, in Verdun, there have been more artillery dropped in that battle than there had been in all wars up to that time period. So we have massive production that's going to have to take place. We will get a gentleman called Walter Reichenau, who is a Jewish German industrialist in this time, who will set up the War Raw Materials Board. And so just an example of how this total war affects economy. And it will start to ration and distribute goods in Germany, make synthetic goods when natural materials aren't available. It is going to regulate the economy, and it is going to deal with the issue of beating back the British blockade. And so state socialism becomes a viable economic blueprint for society during wartime. We'll see the Auxiliary Service Law of 1916, where all German men 17 to 60 had to work for a job related to the war effort. And so we start to see that where we left off in the pre-World War I years with socialism in the lead in many nations, is going to allow socialism to creep in. And even that topic of your DBQ of the civil peace between socialism and the government at home to support the war effort will actually increase the power of socialism in some cases. We'll see women getting to step up and replace male factory workers who are now fighting the war. Women will account for 43% of the labor force in Russia. We'll get to see those suffragettes kind of sit down their cause to go for the war effort as their time to pick up. Take on these jobs, and it will change the view of women. Watch, they're doing that job that's very difficult and laborious and that a man can do. That changes the view. Maybe they aren't inept. And remember, these jobs are dangerous. There's no regulations at the time these women are making artillery and poison gas. And so, actually some will be severely injured. They will be left infertile. And so there'll be some sympathy, I think, really after the war that's going to help drive the cause of war. We should probably just go ahead and give those women the right to vote, which we know happens after World War I. So we're going to see changing attitudes about women resulting in increased rights after the war in Britain, Germany, Austria, and the United States. If you remember Miss Fawcett, she is going to really drive the women to get out into this workforce and sees that this is going to open those doors for those suffragettes. Labor unions are going to support the war effort. We'll see an increased influence and prestige due to increased demand for labor. And so we'll see the labor unions kind of on the rise. Again, the workers. Rationing of food and scarce commodities was instituted. So again, that's socialism. So, you get this much, this many tickets for bread, whatever the rationing is in that nation. And civilians are going to finance the war by buying bonds, which you saw a lot of the propaganda there. There's a propaganda poster here. Food is a weapon, don't waste it. be wise. Each side really aimed at starving out the enemy by cutting off vital supplies to the civilian population. And so that was their goal outside. And so at home, it was to ration as much to keep their side of the war effort going as long as possible. On top of the state socialism being a viable economic blueprint for society, we are also going to see that there's going to be an increase in centralized control by warring regimes. So meaning that government becomes central not only to the economy but to everything. In France, Georges Clemenceau created a dictatorship during the war, and so it's pretty much the idea, like, we're in war. You need one person to be in control, one person to be taking decisions. Germany at this time will become the world's first totalitarian regime, or total control government, in order to control the war effort. We'll talk about that definitely more later. In large part, the impact of the British blockade is going to result in an increasingly repressive government in Germany, and we'll follow that through its course. The British economy was largely planned and regulated due to the war effort. We'll see the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, will also become more of a centralized role in government, even in Britain. This is called war socialism, and war is going to promote greater social equality, thus blurring class distinctions and lessening the gap between rich and poor as well. So we have centralized government, we have socialism in society during the war. We will have war socialism that blurring class distinctions because you all become one nation for one cause, for one war effort, all together, everything. And so even if you're rich, things are scarce. And so we're going to start to see kind of all of those lines we built up blurred. Okay, so that's your little run through of Total War and the introduction to your DBQ topic. That is your homework, to work on your DBQ, to continue reading in your reading outline packet, chapter 27. It is also due the day before spring break, making sure that that is all filled out. And then we will come back together in class and pick up with diplomacy during the war, and go ahead and wrap up World War I. We will then do the Russian Revolution on Thursday, and then you will deal with the Age of Anxiety and studying for your third quarter comprehensive exam over spring break.